John Denver wrote Annie's song in 10 minutes flat, sitting alone on a ski lift above Aspen, Colorado, the cold altitude quiet around him, still settling after a fight with his wife. The song would go on to sell millions of copies across multiple decades, get covered in dozens of languages, and outlive nearly every other thing that happened in that particular stretch of the 1970s. The marriage it was named for lasted 9 more years before it ended, and it ended on terms civil enough that neither party spent the following decades speaking about the other with hostility. Annie Marital, the woman whose name got carried into living rooms across America through a guitar and a man's voice, has lived a life that deserves more than a footnote in somebody else's story. She turned 78 recently, and what she confirmed about John Denver pulls back a curtain that's been drawn for a long time. Born on September 6, 1946, in Minnesota, Annie grew up as one of 4 siblings alongside Linda, Terry, and Ben, raised by Jim and Norma Martell in the Christian faith, in the kind of quiet Midwestern childhood that doesn't generate a lot of stories on its own. Local schools, small-town routines, a world that didn't extend much beyond the county line until she enrolled at a college in St. Peter, Minnesota, and walked into a room where a folk singer named John Denver was performing with the Chad Mitchell Trio. That was 1966, and she was a sophomore, and Denver remembered what she was wearing that night for the rest of his life. Blue jeans, a flannel shirt, penny loafers. She wasn't even in the audience in any traditional sense. She was part of a small stage production running alongside the show, the girl assigned to carry signs across the stage announcing Act 1 and Act 2. Denver caught her from across the room, and the image apparently stuck. They exchanged letters in the weeks that followed, stayed in contact across the months, and 9 months after that first evening, they were engaged and planning a wedding. The ceremony was June 9, 1967. Denver himself hadn't been Denver for long. Born Henry John Deutschendorf Jr. on December 31, 1943, in Roswell, New Mexico, he came from a household shaped by military life. His father, Captain Henry Deutschendorf Sr., was a highly decorated aviator, stern by his son's later account, not openly affectionate, and constantly relocating the family between postings. The longest stretch of stability Denver had as a child ran from 1951 to 1959 in Tucson, Arizona, 8 years that gave him enough ground beneath him to develop into something resembling a recognizable person rather than a kid perpetually recalibrating to a new environment. He was introverted, slow to make friends, most comfortable in his own company. His grandmother gave him an acoustic guitar when he was 11, and that instrument became the one consistent thing across every relocation and every difficult year. By the time he reached Texas Tech University in Lubbock, nominally studying architecture, he was already playing folk clubs and local venues and taking the music more seriously than the degree. He dropped out in 1963 and moved to Los Angeles to pursue a career with no fallback plan and no particular sense of what would happen if it didn't work. Randy Sparks, founder of the New Christy Minstrels, suggested he drop the Deutschendorf surname. John Denver was easier to say and easier to remember, and that was essentially the whole argument. It worked. He found his footing with the Chad Mitchell Trio, eventually replacing Mitchell himself in the group, the lineup reforming as Denver, Boise, and Johnson for the 3 members. He left to go solo when the time felt right, and a self-produced recording of a song he originally called Babe I Hate to Go caught the attention of producer Milt Okun, who reworked it into what the world came to know as Leaving on a Jet Plane. Peter, Paul, and Mary recorded it and pushed it to the top of the Billboard Hot 100. Denver's own version climbed to number 1 on the U.S. Cashbox chart in December of 1969. What most accounts don't spend enough time on is the ground-level effort Denver put in during those early years, touring the Midwest, doing free concerts, walking into radio stations, and talking his way into airtime, building a fan base one free show at a time because nobody else was going to build it for him. His first official studio album, Rhymes and Reasons, came out through RCA Records in 1969. The record that broke him wide open was Poems, Prayers, and Promises in 1971, driven by a radio campaign that his manager Jerry Weintraub pushed across stations nationwide. Take Me Home. Country Roads emerged from that album and embedded itself into American culture in the way that only a handful of songs ever manage. Rocky Mountain High arrived next, written from a genuine personal attachment to Aspen, the mountain town where Denver and Annie had chosen to build their permanent home. Sunshine on My Shoulders, Thank God I'm a Country Boy, and Annie's song rounded out a run through the early to mid-70s that placed Denver at the center of American country music and acoustic pop in a configuration that hadn't existed quite like that before and hasn't been replicated since. The television side kept pace with the recording career. Rocky Mountain Christmas, his seasonal special, pulled in more than 60 million viewers and held the record as the highest-rated broadcast in ABC network history at the time it aired. The BBC commissioned The John Denver Show, giving him a dedicated series on British television. Grammy Awards and American Music Awards accumulated over the decade, and alongside the commercial work, he channeled real energy into humanitarian activity, raising money through performances for the Aspen Camp School for the Deaf, contributing to the Aspen Valley Hospital's $1.7 million capital campaign, and maintaining the 450-acre Windstar Land Conservancy in Aspen, a property that functioned simultaneously as his home, a wildlife sanctuary, and an environmental education center. The environmentalist image wasn't promotional positioning. It matched what he actually did with his time. Annie's song arrived in 1974, and it arrived the way the best things sometimes do, without planning, in the quiet space after an argument when the air between two people has cleared and something unexpected is left behind. Denver and Annie had quarreled, settled it between themselves, and he went skiing to shake off what remained. Somewhere on the Ajax chairlift on Aspen Mountain, sitting above the Rockies with nothing immediate demanding his attention, the melody and the words assembled themselves at the same time. He came home and wrote them down, and 10 minutes after setting pen to paper, it was finished. Annie confirmed this recently with the kind of plainness that makes the story land differently than the romantic mythology surrounding the song usually allows. She described it simply: it started as a love song. It came to her through him, and over time it became something closer to a prayer for Denver than a message directed at his wife. She still cries when it comes through a speaker. She also mentioned Perhaps Love, his duet with Placido Domingo, as another personal favorite, a detail that sits quietly against the backdrop of everything that followed. The personal cost of his career showed up slowly and then all at once. In a 1983 television appearance, Denver traced the erosion of his marriage to the years spent on the road, the accumulated difficulty of reintegrating into home life after extended absence, the inflexibility that develops when two people live parallel lives more often than shared ones. His words were specific enough to suggest he'd thought about it carefully. In the last 4, 5, or 6 years of the marriage, they'd started drifting, and the time apart combined with the inability to absorb each other's lives when they returned created a distance that didn't close on its own. Annie's account centered on identity rather than logistics. Denver's fame arrived so suddenly and grew so large that she lost her own sense of who she was inside of it, no longer able to locate herself independently of a celebrity that was never hers and never felt like it belonged to the man she'd married in St. Peter, Minnesota either. The divorce was finalized in 1982, ending 15 years of marriage. Their 2 adopted children, Zachary John and Anna Kate, stayed connected to both parents. The split managed to stay civil enough that neither party spent the years that followed publicly dismantling the other. One story from that period circulated persistently for decades. During the division of assets, Denver allegedly took a chainsaw to the couple's marital bed, a response, insiders said, to Annie having cut down trees on their shared Aspen property. It's the kind of detail that disrupts the pastoral image with considerable efficiency. The songwriter who wrote about mountains and love and the beauty of the natural world went after a piece of bedroom furniture with a power tool over a real estate dispute with his estranged wife. He was fully human, in other words, and not always at his most considered. Cassandra Delaney came next, an Australian actress he met in Sydney in 1985. They married in 1988, settled in the Aspen home, and their daughter Jessie Bell was born in May 1989. By 1991, the marriage was over, and Delaney's public description of Denver in the aftermath as a vindictive bully was not a measured or diplomatic exit. A drunk driving arrest followed in 1992. A guilty plea came in 1993 after he crashed his Porsche into a tree, earning him a period of probation. The Federal Aviation Administration, aware of the pattern, required Denver to abstain from alcohol as a condition of retaining his pilot's license. He couldn't hold to that condition, and the agency medically disqualified him from operating aircraft the following year. depression and substance use had been threading through his private life beneath the public persona for years, and he'd spoken openly at various points about using marijuana and LSD during the period when he wrote Rocky Mountain High, which generated its own share of backlash from people who found the contradiction between the songs and the behavior inconvenient. Flying had been a real passion, separate from any of the personal difficulty. Denver held a proper pilot's license, pursued aviation seriously, and entered a VH1 promotional contest connected to the hobby. On October 12, 1997, he was piloting a Rutan Long-EZ, a light home-built aircraft, over Monterey Bay near Pacific Grove on the California coast. The plane entered the water. Denver was 53 years old. The investigation that followed identified overlapping failures. The fuel selector valve on the Long-EZ sat behind the pilot's left shoulder in a position that required releasing all flight controls simultaneously to reach it, a design problem so fundamental it's difficult to understand how the aircraft received any certification at all. The fuel gauges read non-linearly and carried no clear markings, making it genuinely difficult to assess remaining fuel under pressure. Pre-flight checks should have flagged both of these issues before the aircraft ever left the runway. They didn't. The Long-EZ was poorly engineered, and the pilot didn't compensate adequately for what the engineering failed to provide, and both things were true simultaneously. John Denver, country singer, songwriter, environmentalist, advocate for conservation and humanitarian causes across 2 decades of public life, went into the Pacific on a Tuesday afternoon in October and didn't come back. Annie Marital never remarried. She lives in Colorado still, near their children and grandchildren, maintaining a life that was always quieter than the one her marriage briefly placed her adjacent to. A Super Bowl commercial that aired this year featured "Take Me Home, Country Roads," and the song charted on the Billboard again, nearly 3 decades after Denver's death. A stage tribute was scheduled for July 10th of this year. The music refuses to stay where the past usually holds things. And when Annie's song comes through a speaker anywhere in the world, but especially somewhere in the Rocky Mountains, where Denver wrote it and where she still lives, she cries. That detail, offered without embellishment by a 78-year-old woman who once carried signs across a stage in St. Peter, Minnesota, and accidentally became the subject of one of the most enduring pieces of American music ever recorded, is probably the most honest thing about all of it.